In the ancient world, when the sun rose over the hills of Judah and the first light touched the stone walls of small villages, there began another day in lives that history would largely forget to record. The voices we hear most clearly from those distant times are often those of kings and prophets, warriors and scribes. But there were other voices too quieter, perhaps, but no less significant. The voices of women who shaped the course of nations through acts of courage that seemed, to the outside world, like simple devotion. Tonight, we're going to step back into that world, into the dusty streets and humble dwellings where women lived lives of quiet strength. We'll walk alongside figures like Ruth, whose loyalty would echo through generations, and we'll glimpse the broader tapestry of ancient life from the marriage customs that bound communities together to the halls of power where queens ruled with wisdom and authority. So, before we begin our journey, feel free to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these explorations of faith and history. And let me know in the comments what story resonates with you. It's always wonderful to see. Now, let's find a quiet space and travel back to a time when the world was younger, and the stories we're about to explore were not yet written in sacred texts, but were simply the lived experiences of real women in real places, facing real choices that would ripple through eternity. Verse 1. The daily life of a Hebrew woman in a rural village. Picture, if you will, a village in the hill country of Judah, perhaps 3,000 years ago. The morning mist clings to the terraced fields carved into the hillsides, and the air carries the mingled scents of olive oil, baking bread, and the earthy smell of recently watered gardens. This is not the grand Jerusalem of Solomon's temple, nor the bustling markets of the great trade cities. This is the Israel of everyday life, where most people lived and worked and raised their families in rhythms as old as the hills themselves. Her name might have been Sarah or Hannah or Rachel, names that carried the weight of ancestral memory and the hope of future generations. Let's call her Miriam, after the sister of Moses and Aaron, for she too carries within her the quiet strength that would sustain her people through generations of joy and sorrow. Miriam rises before dawn, as she has every day for the past 15 years of her marriage. The house is small 2 rooms built of stone and mud brick, with a flat roof where grain is dried, and where the family sometimes sleeps on the hottest nights of summer. Her husband, David, named for the shepherd who would become king, is already stirring in the adjoining room, where he keeps his tools, and where the family's single oil lamp burns through the night. The day begins with water precious, carefully conserved water drawn from the village well. Miriam has walked to that well every morning and evening since she was a child, first following her mother's steady steps, then later bringing her own daughters to learn the ancient choreography of daily survival. The well is more than a source of water. It is the beating heart of the village, where news travels and friendships deepen, where young men and women catch glimpses of one another under the watchful eyes of their mothers. But this morning, like most mornings, Miriam's journey to the well is made in the company of her thoughts and prayers. She carries with her the large clay jar that her mother-in-law crafted years ago, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. As she walks, she speaks quietly to the God of her fathers, as women have done since time immemorial, not with the formal prayers of the temple, but with the intimate conversation of one who knows that the divine hears every whispered concern, every silent thanksgiving. The bread must be baked while the oven is still hot from the previous evening's cooking. Miriam kneads the dough with practiced hands, her movements rhythmic and meditative. The grain has been carefully stored since harvest, ground by hand in the stone mill that sits in the corner of their courtyard. Each grain of wheat or barley represents hours of work planting, tending, harvesting, winnowing, storing. In this world, nothing is wasted. Nothing is taken for granted. As the bread bakes, filling the house with its warm, yeasty fragrance, Miriam turns to the other tasks that will fill her day. There are vegetables to tend in the small garden, behind the house onions and garlic, cucumbers and melons, herbs for seasoning and healing. The soil must be watered carefully, for the rains are seasonal, and cisterns must be conserved for the long, dry months ahead. Her children begin to stir. There is young Samuel, 8 years old, and already learning the ways of his father's trade as a carpenter. He will spend his morning helping David repair a neighbor's roof, learning to judge the quality of wood and the strength of joints. There is Rebecca, 6 years old, who follows her mother's every movement with the intense concentration of one who knows that survival depends on mastering these ancient skills. And there is baby Joshua, barely 2 years old, who will spend much of his day tied to his mother's back as she goes about her work. In this world, children are not separated from adult life, but are woven into its fabric from their earliest days. They learn by watching, by helping, by gradually taking on responsibilities that will prepare them for their own adult roles. The family's few animals must be cared for: 2 goats that provide milk and cheese, a handful of chickens that offer eggs and the occasional feast, and the family's most precious possession, a donkey that can carry heavy loads and serve as transportation to more distant markets. Miriam milks the goats, her hands gentle but firm, speaking to them in the soft, reassuring tones that animals understand across all languages. As the morning progresses, neighbors begin to appear. There is old Hannah, whose husband died 3 years ago, and who now depends on the kindness of the village for her survival. Miriam shares bread with her, and they sit together spinning wool into thread, their hands busy while their voices weave stories of their own. There is young Deborah, newly married and eager to learn the skills that will make her a good wife and mother. Miriam teaches her how to judge the quality of olive oil, how to preserve vegetables for the winter months, how to weave the sturdy cloth that will clothe her family. These women rarely appear in the great stories of their time. They are not mentioned in the genealogies, not recorded in the royal chronicles. Yet they are the foundation upon which everything else rests. They birth the children who will become the next generation of leaders and followers. They preserve the traditions that hold communities together. They create the daily rhythms that give life meaning and stability. The afternoon brings its own responsibilities. Miriam walks to the fields with the other women of the village, carrying her baby and leading Rebecca by the hand. During harvest season, they will work alongside the men, gathering grain and gleaning the corners of the fields, as the law requires ensuring that the poor and the stranger always have something to eat. During other seasons, they might gather wild herbs for medicine and seasoning, or help with the care of the larger animals that belong to the community. The work is hard, but it is also deeply social. The women sing as they work ancient songs that tell the stories of their people, songs that make the time pass more quickly and the work feel less burdensome. They share gossip and concerns, offer advice and comfort, celebrate each other's joys, and mourn each other's sorrows. In a world without books or newspapers, without radios or televisions, the network of women's voices carries the news, preserves the culture, and maintains the bonds that hold society together. As evening approaches, Miriam returns home to prepare the day's main meal. The family will eat together as the sun sets, sharing not just food, but the stories of their day. David will tell of his work. Young Samuel will share what he has learned, and Miriam will contribute her own news from the women's world of the village. These conversations, repeated in countless homes across the ancient world, are where children learn who they are and where they belong in the grand story of their people. The day ends as it began, with prayer and with preparation for tomorrow. Miriam checks that the animals are secure, that the fire is banked safely, that the children are settled for the night. She and David speak quietly together, planning for the next day's work, discussing the needs of their family and their community. In these moments of quiet intimacy, decisions are made that will ripple through generations. Decisions about land and marriage, about tradition and change, about how to live faithfully in a world that is both beautiful and dangerous. As she finally lies down to sleep, Miriam's last thoughts are often prayers of gratitude. She gives thanks for another day of life, for the strength to care for her family, for the community that surrounds and supports her. She prays for her children's future, for her husband's health, for the wisdom to make good choices in the days ahead. And sometimes, in the deep quiet of the night, she feels the presence of the God who has watched over her people through countless generations, the God who sees and values every act of quiet service, every moment of faithful love. This is the world that produced the remarkable women whose stories we find in the pages of Scripture. It is a world where strength was measured not in the ability to conquer enemies, but in the capacity to create and sustain life, where wisdom was found not in the halls of power, but in the daily choices of ordinary people trying to live faithful lives, where heroism was not always dramatic, but was often quiet, persistent, and deeply rooted in love. In this world of daily rhythms and quiet faithfulness, some women would rise to moments of extraordinary significance. Their stories would be remembered and retold, becoming part of the sacred narrative that would guide their people for generations to come. One such woman was Ruth, whose story of loyalty and love would echo through the centuries as a testament to the power of quiet strength. Verse 2, the story of Ruth and her loyalty to Naomi. There are stories that transcend their time and place, stories that speak to something universal in the human heart. The story of Ruth is one of these, a tale that begins in sorrow and loss, but unfolds into something beautiful and redemptive, a testament to the power of loyalty and love to transform even the darkest circumstances. In the days when judges ruled Israel, before there were kings to unite the tribes, there came a time of famine in the land of Judah. The rains failed, the crops withered, and families faced the terrible choice between staying in their ancestral homeland and risking starvation, or leaving everything familiar behind in search of survival. For Elimelech, a man from Bethlehem ironically, the house of bread, the choice became clear. He would take his wife Naomi and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, across the Jordan River to the land of Moab, where reports said the harvests were better. It was meant to be temporary, this exile, a season of waiting until the rains returned to Judah, until the fields could once again support life. But as so often happens in human affairs, the temporary became permanent, and what began as a practical decision became a profound transformation of identity and belonging. The land of Moab was not far from Judah in distance, perhaps a few days' journey on foot, but it was worlds away in culture and faith. The Moabites were descended from Lot, the nephew of Abraham, making them distant relatives of the Israelites, but they worshipped different gods and followed different customs. For a Hebrew family, living in Moab meant navigating daily the tension between survival and faithfulness, between adaptation and identity. In Moab, life continued. The boys grew to manhood, and as young men do, fell in love. Mahlon married a Moabite woman named Ruth, and Chilion married her sister Orpah. These were not merely personal choices, but profound cultural crossings. Hebrew law discouraged marriage with foreign women, fearing that such unions would lead to the worship of foreign gods and the dilution of Hebrew identity. Yet love, as it often does, found a way to bridge the gap between worlds. For perhaps 10 years, this blended family made their life in Moab. We can imagine the conversations around their table, gentle negotiations between different traditions, the way that Ruth and Orpah slowly learned Hebrew customs, while Mahlon and Chilion adapted to Moabite ways. There would have been laughter and disagreement, the ordinary friction and joy of families learning to live together across difference. But then tragedy struck, as it so often does when life seems to have found its rhythm. First, Elimelech died, leaving Naomi a widow in a foreign land. Then, in what must have felt like a cruel multiplication of loss, both sons died as well, young men cut down before their time, leaving behind not only their mother, but their wives, and no children to carry on their names or support the women who loved them. In the ancient world, to be a widow was to be vulnerable. To be a widow without sons was to be truly defenseless. To be a widow without sons in a foreign land was to face a kind of desolation that is difficult for us to fully comprehend. Naomi found herself in precisely this situation, and her response was entirely practical. She would return to Judah, to whatever remained of her people and her place, and trust in the mercy of relatives who might remember their obligations to care for family members in distress. But what of Ruth and Orpah? They were young women, still of childbearing age, still capable of remarrying and building new lives. In Moab, they had families and connections, people who would help them find new husbands and new security. Why would they tie their futures to an elderly woman returning to a foreign land where they would be strangers and outsiders? A conversation that followed would be remembered and treasured for thousands of years, becoming one of the most beautiful passages in all of literature. As the three women prepared to part ways at the border between Moab and Judah, Naomi spoke with the clear-eyed realism of someone who had lost everything but her honesty. "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house," she said, her voice heavy with love and loss. "May the Lord show kindness to you, as you have shown to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." She kissed them goodbye, these daughters-in-law who had become daughters of her heart, and all three women wept. The emotional weight of this moment, three women who had shared joy and sorrow, who had built a life together across cultural boundaries, now facing the reality that love sometimes means letting go, fills the air with a poignancy that transcends time. At first, both younger women protested. "We will go back with you to your people," they said. But Naomi, wise in the ways of the world, pressed them to consider the reality of their situation. "Return home, my daughters," she said. "Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand is turned against me." The practical wisdom of her words was undeniable. Orpah, with tears and kisses, made the reasonable choice. She turned back toward her family and her future in Moab. But Ruth made a different choice, one that would echo through history. "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you," she said, and in her voice was a determination that came from depths of love and commitment that surprised even her. "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." These words, spoken by a young Moabite woman on a dusty road 3,000 years ago, have been repeated in wedding ceremonies, carved on gravestones, and treasured by anyone who has ever understood the power of chosen loyalty. Ruth was not bound to Naomi by blood or law or even reasonable self-interest. She was bound by something deeper, by love that had grown through shared experience, by loyalty that transcended tribal boundaries, by a faith that was willing to risk everything on the uncertain promise of belonging. The journey to Bethlehem was not easy. Two women alone on the roads of the ancient world were vulnerable to bandits, wild animals, and the simple challenge of finding food and shelter. But they made their way step by step until they arrived in the town that had once been Naomi's home, but was now almost foreign to her after her years in Moab. "Can this be Naomi?" the women of the town asked when they saw her, hardly recognizing the woman who had left years earlier as a wife and mother, and now returned as a widow with a foreign daughter-in-law. "Don't call me Naomi," she replied, her voice heavy with grief. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. But Naomi was not truly empty. Beside her stood Ruth, this foreign woman who had chosen to make her people her own people, her God her own God. And in that choice lay the seeds of a story that would unfold in ways none of them could have imagined. They arrived in Bethlehem just as the barley harvest was beginning. The fields around the town were golden with grain, and the sound of workers calling to one another filled the air. For two women with no land and no immediate means of support, this was both opportunity and challenge. The law of Moses provided for the poor and the stranger through the practice of gleaning, allowing those in need to follow behind the harvesters and gather the grain that was left behind. It was honest work, but it was also humble work, and it marked one clearly as being among the most vulnerable members of society. Ruth, young and strong, would do the gleaning, while Naomi, worn down by grief and travel, would remain at home. But which field should Ruth approach? As a foreigner, she had no automatic right to the kindness of the landowners. She would have to depend on the generosity of strangers and the protection of God. As it happened, though the storyteller makes clear that this was divine providence rather than mere chance, Ruth found herself in a field belonging to a man named Boaz, a relative of Naomi's deceased husband. Boaz was a man of standing in the community, wealthy enough to own substantial land and employ many workers, but also known for his kindness and his adherence to the law of God. When Boaz arrived at his fields that morning, he noticed immediately the young woman working alongside his harvesters. "Who is that young woman?" he asked his foreman. "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi," came the reply. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She has been working steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. There was something in Ruth's bearing, in her diligent work and respectful demeanor, that caught Boaz's attention. Here was a woman who had given up everything familiar to care for her mother-in-law, who was now working in the fields to provide for them both, who carried herself with dignity despite her circumstances. Boaz approached Ruth directly, speaking to her with a kindness that must have surprised her. "My daughter," he said, "listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." The generosity of this offer would not have been lost on Ruth. To be allowed to glean was a right, but to be specifically protected and provided for was a gift. Ruth fell at Boaz's feet in gratitude. "Why have I found such favor in your eyes, that you notice me, a foreigner?" she asked. Boaz's response reveals the extent to which Ruth's story had already spread through the community. "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband," he said. "How you left your father and mother and your homeland, and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Throughout that day, Boaz continued to show Ruth special kindness. He invited her to eat with his workers, made sure she had plenty of grain to take home, and instructed his men to deliberately leave extra grain for her to find. When Ruth returned home that evening, she carried with her not just enough grain for several days' meals, but also leftover food from the workers' meal and the beginning of hope that perhaps their future might be brighter than their past. Naomi, seeing the abundance Ruth had brought home, immediately recognized the hand of providence. When she learned that Ruth had been working in Boaz's field, her old eyes lit up with possibilities she hadn't dared to consider. "The Lord bless him," she exclaimed. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." In the complex web of ancient Hebrew law, the concept of the guardian redeemer was crucial for the protection of vulnerable family members. A close male relative had both the right and the responsibility to redeem property that had been sold due to poverty, to marry a widow to continue the family line, and to ensure that the family name and inheritance were preserved. Boaz, as a relative of Elimelech, was potentially such a redeemer for Naomi and Ruth. But how does a destitute widow approach a wealthy landowner about such matters? How does one navigate the delicate balance between propriety and necessity, between hope and presumption? This is where Naomi's wisdom and Ruth's courage would combine to create one of the most beautiful and carefully choreographed scenes in all of biblical literature. The plan that Naomi devised was both bold and proper, risky and respectful. During the harvest season, it was customary for the landowner to spend the night at the threshing floor, protecting the valuable grain from theft. On such a night, after the work was done and the celebration of a successful harvest had concluded, Boaz would sleep beside his grain. This was Ruth's opportunity. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes, Naomi instructed. Then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. Ruth's response was simple and trusting. I will do whatever you say. Here again, we see the quality that defines her throughout the story. A willingness to act in faith, to trust in the wisdom of those who love her, and to risk everything for the possibility of redemption. That night, Ruth made her way to the threshing floor. She waited in the shadows until Boaz had eaten and drunk and settled down to sleep, his heart content with the success of the harvest. Then, quiet as a whisper, she approached and lay down at his feet, covering herself with the edge of his cloak in a gesture that was both humble and symbolically significant. In the middle of the night, Boaz woke to find someone at his feet. Who are you? He asked, and Ruth's answer was both an identification and a request. I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. What Ruth was asking for was marriage not just for companionship or security, but for the fulfillment of the law that would redeem her late husband's family line and provide for Naomi's future. It was a bold request, but it was also a proper one, made in the right way, at the right time to the right person. Boaz's response revealed both his character and his wisdom. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he said. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. But there was a complication. Another relative was closer in line to serve as redeemer, and the law required that he be given the first opportunity to fulfill that role. Boaz promised to resolve the matter according to proper legal procedure, but until then, Ruth must remain at the threshing floor to protect her reputation. Before dawn, Boaz sent Ruth away with her cloak full of barley, ensuring that she would not return to Naomi empty-handed. Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed, he said, understanding that the grain would be assigned to Naomi, that their conversation had gone well. The next day, Boaz went to the town gate, where legal matters were traditionally settled. In the presence of 10 elders, he approached the closer relative and offered him the opportunity to redeem Elimelech's land. The man was interested until Boaz mentioned that redeeming the land would also require marrying Ruth to maintain the family line. At this, the man withdrew his claim, saying it would endanger his own estate. In a ceremony that was both legal and symbolic, the man removed his sandal and gave it to Boaz, transferring to him the right of redemption. Today you are witnesses, Boaz announced to the assembled elders, that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with this property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. The response of the community was one of celebration and blessing. "We are witnesses," they said. "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." And so Ruth, the Moabite woman who had left everything to follow her mother-in-law, found herself not only married to one of the most respected men in Bethlehem, but embraced by the community as a daughter of Israel. Her story, which began with loss and exile, had become a story of redemption and belonging. The conclusion of Ruth's story carries implications that would ripple through history. She and Boaz had a son, whom they named Obed. The women of Bethlehem said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Naomi, who had returned to Bethlehem feeling empty and bitter, now found herself a grandmother, surrounded by love and security. But the story doesn't end there. Obed would grow up to have a son named Jesse, and Jesse would have a son named David, who would become the greatest king in Israel's history, the man after God's own heart. This means that Ruth, the foreign woman who chose loyalty over security, love over convenience, faith over fear, became the great-grandmother of King David. Her name would be included in the genealogy of Jesus himself, making her one of only 4 women mentioned in Matthew's account of the Messiah's ancestry. The story of Ruth is many things a beautiful tale of friendship between women, a romance that unfolds with perfect timing and divine providence, a legal drama that shows how ancient laws protected the vulnerable. But perhaps most profoundly, it is a story about the power of choice and the way that individual decisions, made in faithfulness and love, can reshape the course of history. Ruth chose loyalty when she could have chosen security. She chose love when she could have chosen convenience. She chose faith when she could have chosen fear. And in making these choices, she became not just a beloved daughter-in-law, a cherished wife, and a devoted mother, but a permanent part of the story of God's people, a testament to the truth that the heart of faith is often found not in grand gestures, but in quiet acts of steadfast love. Ruth's story resonates across the centuries because it speaks to something universal in human experience: the longing to belong, the power of loyalty, the way that love can transform strangers into family. But her story also emerges from a very specific cultural context, one shaped by ancient laws and customs that governed marriage, property, and the place of women in society. To fully understand the depth of Ruth's choices and their significance, we must turn our attention to that broader world, the world of ancient Hebrew law and custom, where the daily lives of women were shaped by traditions as old as the patriarchs themselves. Verse 3, the cultural deep dive into ancient Hebrew marriage and property laws to understand the world in which Ruth made her extraordinary choices. We must step back and examine the intricate web of laws, customs, and social structures that governed ancient Hebrew society. These were not arbitrary rules imposed by distant authorities, but rather a carefully constructed system designed to protect the vulnerable, preserve family lines, and maintain the delicate balance between individual needs and community stability. In the ancient Near East, marriage was never simply a matter of personal choice or romantic love, though affection certainly played a role in many unions. Marriage was fundamentally an economic and social contract, a way of creating alliances between families, ensuring the continuation of bloodlines, and providing security for women in a world where they had few legal rights or economic opportunities of their own. The process typically began with negotiations between families, often when the prospective bride and groom were still children. These arrangements were not cold or calculating, but rather represented the wisdom of parents who understood that successful marriages required compatibility not just between individuals, but between entire family networks. A young man's parents would carefully consider not only the character and beauty of a potential bride, but also her family's reputation, their economic standing, and their ability to contribute to the union through dowry and ongoing support. The concept of the moher or bride price was central to these negotiations. This was not, as sometimes misunderstood, a payment for purchasing a woman as property. Rather, it was a form of security for the bride and her family compensation for the loss of her labor and childbearing capacity, and a guarantee that the groom's family was serious about their commitment and financially capable of supporting a wife. The moher might be paid in silver, livestock, or service, and it became part of the bride's personal property, providing her with some measure of economic independence. The story of Jacob's 7 years of service for Rachel illustrates this practice beautifully. When Jacob fell in love with Rachel, but had no wealth to offer as moher, her father Laban accepted his labor as payment. "I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter Rachel," Jacob proposed, and Laban agreed. The text tells us that Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. This arrangement protected Rachel by ensuring her suitor's commitment while allowing love to flourish within the framework of proper legal and social structures. Once the moher was agreed upon, the betrothal period began. This was a formal engagement that was legally binding and could only be dissolved through divorce. During this time, which might last a year or more, the bride remained in her father's house while final preparations were made for the wedding. She would use this time to prepare her household goods, learn from her mother and other married women about the skills she would need as a wife, and gradually adjust to the idea of leaving her childhood home. The bride also received a dowry from her own family, typically consisting of clothing, jewelry, household items, and sometimes land or other property. This dowry remained her personal property throughout the marriage and could not be touched by her husband except in cases of extreme necessity. It served as her insurance policy, providing some measure of financial security if she became widowed or divorced. The wedding ceremony itself was a community celebration that might last for a week or more. It began with the groom's procession to the bride's house, often accompanied by musicians, dancers, and wedding guests carrying torches or lamps. The bride, heavily veiled and adorned with jewelry, would be escorted to the groom's house in a procession that wound through the entire community, allowing everyone to share in the joy and to witness the legitimacy of the union. The wedding feast was a time of abundant hospitality, with the groom's family expected to provide food and drink for all who came to celebrate. This was not merely social custom, but a religious obligation, as hospitality was considered one of the highest virtues in Hebrew culture. The feast also served practical purposes, creating bonds between families and communities that would provide support networks for the new couple throughout their married life. But what happened when this carefully constructed system encountered the harsh realities of death, poverty, or other disasters? This is where the complex laws of redemption and levirate marriage came into play, creating safety nets that protected the most vulnerable members of society. The institution of the Goel, or kinsman redeemer, was central to this system. A Goel was a male relative who had both the right and the responsibility to act on behalf of family members in crisis. If a man was forced by poverty to sell his ancestral land, the Goel could redeem it, paying the current owner and returning the property to the family. If a man died leaving debts, the Goel might pay them to preserve the family's honor and security. If a man was murdered, the Goel served as the avenger of blood, pursuing justice for the crime. Most relevant to Ruth's story was the Goel's role in caring for widows and preserving family lines through levirate marriage. When a man died without sons, his closest male relative was expected to marry the widow and father children who would be considered the offspring of the deceased husband, thus continuing his family line and preserving his inheritance. This law served multiple purposes. It provided economic security for the widow, ensured that family property remained within the bloodline, and maintained the deceased man's name and memory within the community. The law of levirate marriage, found in Deuteronomy, was quite specific. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her, and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. However, the law also recognized that such arrangements could not be forced. If the brother-in-law refused to fulfill this duty, the widow could bring the matter before the elders at the city gate. In a public ceremony designed to shame the reluctant relative, she would remove his sandal and spit in his face, declaring, "This is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line." From that day forward, his family would be known as the family of the unsandaled one, a mark of shame that would follow his descendants. The removal of the sandal had deep symbolic meaning in ancient Hebrew culture. The foot and the sandal represented possession and authority. To walk on land was to claim it. To remove one's sandal was to relinquish that claim. When the closer relative in Ruth's story removed his sandal and gave it to Boaz, he was formally transferring not just his right to redeem the property, but his authority and responsibility toward Ruth and Naomi. Women's property rights within this system were limited, but not non-existent. A wife's dowry remained her personal property, and in some cases, she could inherit land from her father if there were no male heirs. The daughters of Zelophehad provide a famous example of this principle in action. When their father died without sons, they approached Moses with a legal challenge. Why should our father's name disappear from his clan because he had no son? Give us property among our father's relatives. Moses brought their case before God, and the response established important precedent. What Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right. You must certainly give them property as an inheritance among their father's relatives, and give their father's inheritance to them. This ruling was later expanded to provide a more complete legal framework. If a man died without sons, his inheritance would go to his daughters. If he had no daughters, to his brothers. If no brothers, to his father's brothers. And so on through the extended family network. These laws might seem restrictive by modern standards, but within their historical context, they provided remarkable protection for women and families. In a world where women had few economic opportunities outside of marriage and family, these regulations ensured that they would not be abandoned to destitution when tragedy struck. The system of redemption meant that family land could not be permanently lost to outsiders, maintaining the economic base that supported each tribe and clan. The regulations also reflected a profound understanding of human nature and social dynamics. The requirement that a Goel publicly declare his intentions prevented secret deals that might disadvantage the vulnerable. The involvement of community elders in legal proceedings ensured that decisions were made transparently and with proper witness. The emphasis on maintaining family lines and property within tribal boundaries preserved the social structure that had been established when the Israelites first settled in the Promised Land. Religious considerations were woven throughout these legal structures. The land itself was considered God's gift to the people of Israel, divided among the tribes and clans according to divine command. To allow this land to be permanently lost through sale or neglect was seen as a violation of the covenant relationship between God and his people. The year of Jubilee, celebrated every 50 years, provided another layer of protection by returning all land to its original tribal allocation and freeing Hebrew slaves, ensuring that economic inequality could not become permanently entrenched. Marriage laws also reflected religious values, particularly the importance of maintaining the distinctive identity of God's chosen people. The prohibitions against marrying Canaanites and other neighboring peoples were not based on racial prejudice, but on the understanding that intermarriage often led to the worship of foreign gods and the adoption of practices that violated Hebrew law. The story of Solomon's foreign wives, who turned his heart after other gods, illustrates the dangers that the law sought to prevent. Yet the law also made provision for foreigners who chose to join themselves to the God of Israel, as Ruth did. Her declaration, "Your people will be my people, and your God my God," represented a formal conversion that made her eligible for full participation in Hebrew society, including marriage to a Hebrew man. The fact that she is remembered as one of the great heroines of faith demonstrates that ethnicity was ultimately less important than commitment to the covenant community. The complexity of these laws required considerable expertise to navigate properly. This is why legal matters were typically handled at the city gate, where the elders who knew the law and the local circumstances could provide guidance and ensure that all procedures were followed correctly. The city gate was not just a physical entrance to the town, but a center of legal, commercial, and social activity. Here contracts were made, disputes were resolved, and important announcements were proclaimed. The gate typically had chambers or recesses where people could sit and conduct business in the shade. Stone benches provided seating for the elders, whose presence lent authority and legitimacy to proceedings. The requirement that legal matters be conducted publicly, with multiple witnesses present, protected all parties from false accusations and ensured that agreements would be remembered and enforced by the community. For women like Ruth and Naomi, navigating this legal system required not only understanding the law, but also knowing how to approach the right people at the right time with the right procedures. Naomi's wisdom in guiding Ruth through the process of appealing to Boaz demonstrates the importance of female knowledge, networks in preserving and transmitting understanding of legal and social customs. The marriage customs and property laws of ancient Israel were far from perfect by modern standards, but they represented a sophisticated attempt to balance individual needs with community stability, to protect the vulnerable while preserving essential social structures, and to maintain religious identity while allowing for growth and adaptation. They created a framework within which stories like Ruth's could unfold stories of loyalty and love, of courage and redemption, of individuals making choices that would echo through generations. Understanding these customs helps us appreciate the full significance of Ruth's decision to follow Naomi. She was not simply choosing personal loyalty over convenience. She was choosing to place herself within a completely different legal, social, and religious system. She was trusting that the God of Israel and the laws of Israel would provide for her welfare, as they had promised to provide for all who sought refuge under divine wings. Her story succeeded not because she circumvented these ancient systems, but because she worked within them, allowing their protective mechanisms to function as they were designed to do. In doing so, she demonstrated that laws and customs, however ancient and seemingly rigid, could accommodate great love and great faith, creating space for the extraordinary within the framework of the ordinary. But the world of ancient women was not limited to the villages and towns of Israel. Beyond the Jordan River, in the great cities and kingdoms that surrounded the Hebrew settlements, women lived very different lives, governed by different laws and customs, wielding different kinds of power. To fully appreciate the choices available to women in the ancient world, we must now turn our attention to a figure who represents a completely different model of female strength and influence. A Hittite queen whose story unfolds not in fields and threshing floors, but in the halls of international power. Verse 4. The contrasting life of a powerful Hittite queen, far to the north of the hills where Ruth gleaned barley in Boaz's fields, beyond the cedar forests of Lebanon and across the plains of ancient Anatolia, lay the magnificent capital of the Hittite Empire. Here, in the city of Hattusa, carved into a mountain plateau and protected by massive stone walls, lived women whose experiences of power and influence were as different from those of Hebrew village women as the grand palaces were from humble stone houses. Let us enter the world of Queen Paduepa, one of the most remarkable women of the ancient world, whose letters and royal seals have survived to tell us a story of female power that operated on an entirely different scale from the quiet strength we have witnessed in Israel. Paduepa lived in the 13th century before Christ, during the height of Hittite power, when their empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to the upper reaches of the Euphrates River, encompassing much of what we know today as Turkey, Syria, and parts of Iraq. Her story begins, like so many royal stories, with marriage and diplomacy. She was born into the priesthood of the goddess Hepat in the city of Kumani, daughter of a high priest named Pentip Shari. In Hittite society, religious office was often hereditary, and the priesthood of major deities carried significant political as well as spiritual authority. From her earliest years, Paduepa would have been educated not only in the rituals and mysteries of the goddess, but in the arts of reading and writing, in the complex diplomatic protocols that governed relations between kingdoms, and in the intricate theology that bound together the diverse peoples of the Hittite realm. When she came of age, political necessity brought her to the attention of King Hattusili III, who had recently seized the throne from his nephew in a coup that required careful legitimization. Marriage to a high-ranking priestess would strengthen his religious authority and help consolidate his rule. But what began as a political alliance developed into something much deeper, a partnership that would transform both their lives and the nature of Hittite kingship itself. The wedding ceremony that united Paduepa and Hattusili would have been a spectacle beyond anything imaginable in the simple villages of Israel. The Hittite capital was a city of grand temples and elaborate palaces, where the king was considered the earthly representative of the storm god, and the queen served as the high priestess of the sun goddess. Their marriage was not merely a political or personal union, but a sacred drama that represented the divine marriage between the god and goddess who protected the empire. From the moment she became queen, Paduepa wielded power in ways that would have been unthinkable for women in most ancient societies. Hittite law and custom granted queens significant authority, and Paduepa used that authority to its fullest extent. She conducted her own diplomatic correspondence with foreign rulers, negotiating treaties and managing international relations as an equal partner with her husband. Her royal seal, bearing her name and titles in Hittite hieroglyphs, has been found on documents throughout the ancient Near East, testament to her active role in imperial governance. One of her most famous diplomatic achievements was her correspondence with Nefertari, the beloved queen of Pharaoh Ramesses II of Egypt. These two powerful women exchanged letters as part of the broader diplomatic process that led to the world's first recorded peace treaty between the Hittite and Egyptian empires. In their letters, preserved on clay tablets and papyrus, we can hear voices of women speaking as equals to the mightiest rulers of their age. "My sister, may all go well with you," Paduepa wrote to Nefertari. "May the gods of Egypt and the gods of Hatti make peace prevail, and may they make brotherhood between the king of Egypt and the king of Hatti forever." These were not ceremonial pleasantries, but substantive diplomatic communications that helped shape the balance of power in the ancient world. The fact that such negotiations were conducted woman to woman, rather than solely between the kings, demonstrates the unique position that queens could occupy in certain ancient societies. The contrast with the world we have been exploring in Israel could hardly be more stark, where Hebrew women found their greatest security in family relationships and their highest honor in maternal devotion. Hittite queens like Paduepa operated in the realm of international politics and religious authority, where Ruth's story unfolds in fields and marketplaces. Among the daily struggles of ordinary people, Paduepa's world was one of palace intrigue, diplomatic summits, and religious ceremonies that drew thousands of participants from across the empire. The physical setting of Paduepa's life reflected these differences. The royal palace at Hattusa was a complex of interconnected buildings covering several acres. with reception halls capable of accommodating hundreds of dignitaries, private apartments furnished with luxury goods imported from across the known world, and temple precincts where she presided over religious ceremonies of breathtaking complexity and grandeur. The walls were decorated with reliefs showing the king and queen in their divine roles, receiving tribute from subject peoples, conducting rituals that ensured the prosperity of the empire. Her daily routine would have been structured around the dual demands of political administration and religious obligation. As queen, she was expected to receive ambassadors, review reports from provincial governors, oversee the complex bureaucracy that managed the empire's resources, and participate in the royal council that made decisions affecting millions of subjects. As high priestess, she had to maintain the elaborate ritual calendar that marked the seasons, ensure the proper conduct of festivals that could last for weeks, and serve as intermediary between the human and divine realms. The education that prepared her for these roles was comprehensive and sophisticated. Hittite queens needed to be literate in multiple scripts and languages, as the empire encompassed peoples who spoke Hittite, Hurrian, Akkadian, and various other tongues. They needed to understand the legal traditions that governed different regions, the religious practices of various subject peoples, and the diplomatic customs that regulated relations with neighboring kingdoms. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Hittite royal court maintained extensive libraries and schools where such knowledge was preserved and transmitted. Yet for all her power and prestige, Paduhipa's position was also precarious in ways that Ruth's was not. Royal women in the ancient world were always vulnerable to the shifting tides of palace politics, to the ambitions of rivals, to the possibility that military defeat or political upheaval could destroy everything they had built. The higher the elevation, the farther the potential fall. This vulnerability is evident in the later years of Paduhipa's reign, when the Hittite Empire came under increasing pressure from various enemies. The Sea Peoples, mysterious invaders from the west, were disrupting trade routes and threatening coastal cities. Assyria was growing stronger and more aggressive to the east. Internal rebellions were weakening the empire from within. In her later letters, we can detect a note of anxiety that was absent from her earlier, more confident communications. "The land is dying," she wrote in one of her final surviving letters, referring to a series of natural disasters that seemed to signal divine displeasure. As high priestess, she bore particular responsibility for maintaining the favor of the gods, and the apparent failure of that mission would have weighed heavily on her conscience. The contrast with Ruth, whose small acts of loyalty were rewarded with personal happiness and family security, becomes poignant when we consider that Paduhipa's grand achievements ultimately could not save her empire from collapse. The religious dimension of Paduhipa's power deserves particular attention, as it represents a model of female spiritual authority that was rare in the ancient world. As high priestess of the sun goddess Ariniti, she was responsible for maintaining the cosmic order that kept the empire stable and prosperous. This was not merely ceremonial authority, but genuine spiritual power, rooted in the Hittite belief that the health of the kingdom depended on the proper conduct of religious rituals. The sun goddess held a unique position in the Hittite pantheon. Unlike in many ancient cultures where solar deities were male, the Hittites worshipped the sun as female, the great mother who brought light and life to the world. This theological framework provided space for female religious authority that was impossible in cultures where all the major deities were male and all the priests were men. Paduhipa was not simply participating in religious ceremonies led by men. She was the chief officiant, the one whose prayers and rituals were believed to maintain the divine blessing on the empire. Her role required her to master complex liturgical texts, to know the proper procedures for hundreds of different ceremonies, to understand the astronomical calculations that determined when festivals should be held. Surviving Hittite religious texts show that these were not simple rituals, but elaborate theological dramas that could last for days and involved precise choreography, specific costumes and props, and careful attention to every detail of performance. One of the most fascinating aspects of Paduepa's story is how she managed to maintain her power and influence even after her husband's death. In many ancient societies, queens became politically irrelevant once they were widowed, their authority having been derived entirely from their relationship to the king. But Paduepa continued to be an active force in Hittite politics during the reign of her son, Tedaliah IV, serving as queen mother and senior advisor. Her seals continue to appear on important documents. Her name continues to be invoked in diplomatic correspondence, suggesting that her personal authority transcended the traditional limitations of gender and family role. This longevity of influence points to one of the key differences between the models of female power represented by Ruth and Paduepa. Ruth's strength was rooted in relationship, her loyalty to Naomi, her love for Boaz, her devotion to her children. When those relationships were secure, she was secure. Paduepa's power was more institutionalized, embedded in formal roles and official positions that gave her authority independent of her personal relationships. Both models had their advantages and their vulnerabilities. The economic dimension of Paduepa's life also contrasts sharply with what we have seen in Israel, where Hebrew women typically managed household economies involving a few animals, small gardens, and basic crafts. Paduepa oversaw the management of vast estates, the collection of tribute from subject peoples, the funding of major construction projects, and the support of religious establishments that employed thousands of priests, scribes, and support staff. Surviving administrative documents show her involvement in decisions about everything from the allocation of grain supplies during famines to the funding of diplomatic missions to foreign courts. She owned property in her own name, controlled significant financial resources, and could make economic decisions that affected the lives of thousands of people. This level of economic authority was virtually unknown among women in most ancient societies. Yet despite all these differences, there are also surprising parallels between Paduepa's story and the stories of Hebrew women we have explored. Like Ruth, she was willing to cross cultural boundaries, incorporating religious and diplomatic traditions from various parts of the empire into her own practice. Like Naomi, she served as a mentor and guide to younger women, training other priestesses and queens in the skills they would need to fulfill their roles. Like the village women we met in our first segment, she understood that her primary responsibility was to create and maintain the conditions in which life could flourish. The surviving artistic representations of Paduepa show her in various roles: as queen receiving tribute, as priestess conducting rituals, as diplomat meeting with foreign ambassadors. But perhaps the most revealing images are those that show her in family contexts, with her husband and children, participating in the ordinary human, relationships that provided meaning and continuity, even in the midst of imperial grandeur. These images remind us that even the most powerful women of the ancient world were still embedded in networks of family and community that shaped their identities and their choices. The ultimate fate of Paduepa remains somewhat mysterious. She disappears from the historical record during the final years of the Hittite Empire, as the kingdom succumbed to the various pressures that were overwhelming it. We do not know whether she lived to see the final collapse of Hattusa, whether she fled to safety elsewhere, or whether she died still trying to preserve the empire she had helped to govern. What we do know is that her model of female power died with the Hittite kingdom, leaving behind only archaeological traces and fragmentary texts that hint at a different way of organizing society and distributing authority. The contrast between Paduepa's world and Ruth's world illuminates the range of possibilities that existed for women in the ancient Near East. Neither model was inherently superior to the other. Each represented an adaptation to different circumstances, different opportunities, different challenges. Ruth found her strength through loyalty and love, creating lasting relationships that provided security and meaning across generations. Paduepa found her strength through institutional authority and political skill, wielding power on a scale that affected the course of international relations. Both women faced the fundamental challenge that confronted all women in the ancient world: how to create meaningful lives and exercise genuine influence within societies that were structured by and for men. Both found ways to transcend the limitations of their circumstances, though through very different strategies and with very different results. Both left legacies that continued long after their deaths, though Ruth's legacy was preserved in sacred literature, while Poduepa's was buried in archaeological ruins. Their stories remind us that the past was not a monolith, that ancient societies offered various models for organizing human relationships and distributing power and authority. They also remind us that individual choices, whether made in humble village settings or in grand palace chambers, can have consequences that ripple across centuries, shaping the stories that future generations will tell about what it means to be human, to be faithful, to be strong. Conclusion. As we reach the end of our journey through these ancient worlds, we find ourselves contemplating lives lived thousands of years ago in places that seem impossibly distant from our own experience. Yet the women we have met, the village woman grinding grain in the early morning light, Ruth choosing loyalty over security, Paduhipa wielding power in the halls of empire, speak to us across the centuries with voices that remain surprisingly clear and compelling. Their stories remind us that strength takes many forms. Sometimes it appears in the quiet consistency of daily faithfulness, in the patient tending of family and community that creates the foundation upon which all else rests. Sometimes it manifests in moments of extraordinary choice, when individuals decide to risk everything for love or loyalty or faith. Sometimes it operates through institutional authority and political skill, shaping the course of nations and the balance of international power. Each of these models of strength emerged from specific circumstances, specific opportunities, specific constraints. None of them represents the only way to live a meaningful life or to exercise genuine influence in the world. But together, they illustrate the rich diversity of human experience and the remarkable capacity of individuals to transcend the limitations of their circumstances through courage, wisdom, and love. The quiet strength of women in the Old Testament continues to resonate because these stories capture something essential about the human condition: our longing for belonging, our capacity for loyalty, our ability to find hope in the midst of loss, our potential for transformation and redemption. They remind us that the most important victories are often the quiet ones, achieved not through conquest or dominance, but through persistence, faithfulness, and the kind of love that chooses to remain when it would be easier to leave. In our own time, when the nature of strength and authority continues to evolve, when we are still learning how to create societies that honor the full range of human gifts and potential, these ancient voices offer both inspiration and wisdom. They suggest that true strength is not about power over others, but about the capacity to create life, to sustain relationships, to build communities, to remain faithful to our deepest values, even when the cost is high. As you continue on your own journey, may you find your own expression of quiet strength, your own way of making choices that honor both your individual calling and your connections to the larger human story. And may you remember that every act of faithfulness, every moment of loyalty, every choice made in love rather than fear contributes to the great tapestry of human experience that connects us all across time and space. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of ancient lives and timeless truths. Until we meet again in another corner of history, may your own story be one of quiet strength and enduring grace.